Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the first session of the BSHS Digital Festival 2023. My name is Dr. Sam Robinson. I'm the conference chair for BSHS. This is the first panel of our wonderful conference this week, entitled New Tracks, Reflections on Collaborative Working Through Railways. And I would like to hand over to this morning's chair, Dr. Amanda Rees of the University of York. Mandy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sam. It is a real pleasure to be here with all of you and to kick off the BSHS's fantastic Digital Festival 2023 with such a fantastic panel on collaborative working through railways, looking at how academics and museum staff can work together to create a better understanding of one of the most important transport technologies of our time. So I've got four colleagues with me here today, and I'm very happy to introduce them to you. We have, first of all, Dr. Mike Esbester, who has a collaborative project with the National Railway Museum, Railway Work, Life and Death. And his work there has done some really outstanding connections between collaborators, between connecting the archives with people's personal experiences. We have Dr. Erin Beeston, who's done also fantastic work on disseminating her research on the history and the heritage of Liverpool Road Station, working closely with the Science Museum group in that. We have Dr. Sam Robinson, who has outstanding expertise in the 20th century history of technology and is using that expertise to enhance our understandings of the role of the LMS Research Laboratory. And last but very much not least, we have John McGoldrick, who is Curator of Industrial History for Leeds Industrial Museum, and his work is looking at current research in colonial collections. So I will begin then by tossing back to Sam, who will take us through some of the key themes of his work in this area. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Mandy. I'm going to show you some slides, which you can hopefully now see. So I have been working on trying to get this project funded for a number of years. So I'm going to talk about a project that's not yet funded, but I've decided to start it anyway. So I would like to work on a project on the history of the Derby Rail Research Laboratory, of which this is a photograph of. Now, Derby was founded on the back of a long history of railway engineering centres, not places that built trains necessarily, but built new technologies for the railways. To coin the phrase that me and my collaborators have used, they imagineered the future. And so the institute that I'm interested in was founded in 1964. This is it being opened by the late Duke of Edinburgh, and in the background with the slightly more shiny head is Dr. Beeching. Boo hiss, Dr. Beeching, who thought that this was a good idea and shutting stations was a better one. So it's founded as a scientific institute like any other. It had scientists that did real things. These two gentlemen have written one of the only memoirs from Derby about the oil division, and they invented, for instance, a way of diagnostically testing when engines were going to fail. And thanks to Derby, despite the popular image, the railway reliability did improve through the 1970s. Failure rates did reduce. But what Derby's really known for, which is about 10% of what it actually did, which is why this project's important, is big technologies of the railway. So on the top here, we've got APT-1, which is a gas turbine powered locomotive. On the left, we've got APT-2, which is a tilting train, you might notice, which is one of the reasons it's said to have failed. But the pendolinos that make you sick when you're a bit hungover going back and forth from London to Manchester are based on that technology, which we sold to Italy for not a lot of money, and then they sold back to us for a lot of money. More successfully, HST, high-speed train, which is the bottom left. And those two technologies tend to be talked about a lot. The bottom right, which is the Railbuzz project, less, but the Railbuzz project can tell us lots of interesting things about internationalization of technology. So this is a train made from buzz parts, borrowed from British Leyland. It was very cheap. It was supposed to last a couple of years. It lasted for 40 years. This is one that we forced the Irish to buy off us. We also sold them to Iran, despite the fact that publicly we weren't supposed to be talking to Iran, but you know, after the fall of the Tsar. But that's irrelevant when you're trying to make some foreign currency exchange. They also built things that they didn't necessarily have a purpose for. Here's the maglev that they built, they designed, they developed, and then they had no application for, so they put it famously between Birmingham International and Birmingham Airport. It cost a lot of money. It ran for 11 years. And then a foreign company built the latest version that's still there. This gentleman bought one for the princely sum of £100 and put it in his garden in 2011 and probably promptly got divorced. The British Railway Museum, the National Railway Museum of York, does have one. But to show how little Derby features in the history of the railways, it's shoved up in a corner at the minute because no one's quite sure how to display this thing. So this 5-ton car sits up the corner. Now, there are other things that Derby did. This is possibly, I'm going to show you a little video. This is possibly the most famous example of bad science communication ever. Bear with me.
The train crash was designed to be a spectacular demonstration that it is safe to transport nuclear fuel in steel flasks. It was described as the most horrendous and pessimistic crash that could be arranged. The train ran into the lid of the flask at nearly 100 miles an hour. As predicted, the lid stayed on. But today, Greenpeace said the crash was rigged. And they produced a document which they say was leaked to them from the nuclear industry, and which they claim shows the crash was meant to cause only superficial damage to the flask. First, Greenpeace say the flask was positioned with a vulnerable valve away from the train to protect it. The CEGB say the flask was positioned so the train would exert maximum leverage on the lid. Greenpeace claim the CEGB unbolted the heavy engine inside the locomotive so that during the crash it would sail over the flask instead of pushing into it. The CEGB say rubbish. The engine was not tampered with in any way. Greenpeace claim the carriages had weights in them to keep them on the ground and prevent them rising up and falling onto the flask because this could have damaged it. Again, rubbish, say the CEGB. There were no weights in the carriages. Finally, the allegation is that the train was specially chosen because it would crumple more easily than other trains. Again, rubbish, say the CEGB. The locomotive was the heaviest available.
I find it quite laughable that anyone would consider we would put our reputation on the line in front of the engineers, the scientists, the cameras of the world. I mean, it's nonsensical.
Isn't it just possible that perhaps some engineers might have pulled a few...
Now, the bit that it goes on to that I've just cut off is that some engineers would have been up to naughty things. And the answer is, of course not. We'd fire them if that was the case. So now that's not the only brush with nuclear things that British Railways and Derby had. I wanted to get this patent over the weekend from the British Patent Library, where it's been removed as a download. So I had to go to the International Atomic Energy Authority in Vienna, who have a copy if you want it on their website. So in 1970, Britain, and this is my last example, so don't panic, Andy, British Railways patented a UFO, and I'm not making it up. It's not an urban myth. Here's the patent with the drawing, because they wanted to devise small ways of powering trains. This is where this project becomes a history of science project, because what's interesting and what's very much understudied is the relationship of different national engineering research institutes funded by the government, but not based at universities, in terms of competition and cooperation. Amazingly, the video is an example of cooperation, and this is an example of competition from slightly earlier with the same nuclear scientists. You can ask me questions in later about the UFO. This was obviously not well advertised in the 70s when it was patented. In 1996, when Derby was being shut down, it was leaked to the press. So this is the Daily Express. This diagram here is very similar to hovercraft. The Derby also made hovercraft, and the hovercraft story is attached. There's lots of things that I've missed out here about Derby. This is some of the other images that the National Railway Museum have. There's about 2 years worth of cataloguing of archive that's uncatalogued. And finally, I just wanted to use this opportunity to really give a plug. Despite the lack of funding, I intend and hope this year to start conducting oral history interviews of the staff of Derby. If anyone listening to this has anyone that they know who works at Derby, I'd love to hear from them so that we can start recording their history while we still continue to find money and get the archive catalogued. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sam. From shiny heads to tilting trains, that was a rollicking ride, it must be said. And as Sam said, we have a Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar. If you have queries that you'd like to ask any of the panelists, please do pop your query in there and we will answer them when we get to the discussion session at the end. But for now, can I turn over now to John McGoldrick for his introductions and thoughts?
Thanks, Amanda. Again, I'll show you some slides. So, Leeds Museums and Galleries based in West Yorkshire in the north of England. We have a designated railway collection, which means it's of national significance. I'm showing you this slide to kind of illustrate some of the internal debates that we've had around colonialism and railways. This is an image by quite a well-known photographer called Colin Garrett, and depicting a young sort of South Asian boy next to a kind of thrusting locomotive, probably of British origin, and it's quite clear what the point is trying to make. I had a very interesting and slightly heated discussion with our social media person about how we actually presented this. I had acquired this image for the collection as an example of the kind of narratives that are told through this kind of photography, and our social media person wanted to put a tweet out saying that railway enthusiasts were insufficiently anti-racist. So it was quite a difficult internal debate in terms of how we actually talk about colonialism and the very sort of obvious stories that we have to tell. I'm going to very quickly sort of talk about some of the work that we've done, and also some of the frustrations that we've come up against in terms of resources and breaking into kind of research networks. I'm very interested in trying to bring together the colonial metropolis, as in Leeds. It's a funny thing to say, Leeds as a metropolis, with colonised territories, like this sugar plantation in India is Katoli Sugar Estates. And a Leeds company called John Fowler made a locomotive called Cheeto, which was exported originally to work on Karachi docks in modern-day Pakistan. And on the left, there's an engineering drawing of the Hunslet Engine Works, and a whole community built up around the development of these railway works. They had streets called Locomotive Street, Tender Street, even. And I'm just really interested in sort of trying to kind of make some sort of connection and just identify possible encounters between people on the ground. Mike, in our discussion on Friday, made a very important point about where are the people, and that's something that's kind of really resonated with me. Image on the left is the building of the Sierra Leone Government Railway in about 1896, and there's a locomotive there which has a nameplate called Bai Bure. Bai Bure was actually a Tammany chief, and he instigated a rebellion when the authorities, to pay for the railway partly, instigated a hut tax, which was effectively a poll tax. And he delayed the building of the railway for quite some time as well, which is something that's never referred to in the official and the more kind of standard histories. On the right, image of Bai Bure after he'd been captured. Lots of scorched earth tactics by the colonial authorities, but really interesting the fact that there's a nameplate, actually a locomotive named after him. Still a lot more work to be done on that. Back people in Leeds, this is a diary, or it's almost like a dossier by an employee of the Robert Hudson wagon builders and light railway suppliers. He worked for the company for 40 years, and he compiled an alphabetical dossier on all the employees of the company that knew, and there's references to the various colonial outposts of the Robert Hudson company, and references to someone who ran the India branch of the company as well. Just an example of those people's stories that we need to try and dig into more. We don't have to go too far to find colonial issues, colonial stories. This is from the catalogue of Robert Hudson's, where they proudly kind of advertised the fact that they'd built the Luanda Railway, which was in Portuguese West Africa, now Angola. So you don't have to start digging in alternative sources. The information is often like front and centre right there. Examples of forced labour used here, the United Nations, or then the League of Nations, investigated the issues there, and there were definite examples of forced labour being used on the railway. Another Leeds company, Leeds Forge company, built basically wagons for carrying people. This is a special pilgrim coach, which were brought into action to serve the especially busy Mela periods when huge demand on the railways, no toilets, no seats, very little in the way of windows. There was a famous case of a Mr. Narayan who took the Barcia Light Railway to court for having bought a third-class ticket. He was given a fourth-class seat in what was effectively a wagon. Beautiful piece of art. This is a clutch plate by a Huddenslet employee, a commissioning engineer called Huey. I'll not give you his full name for obvious reasons, that will become obvious. And he was the commissioning engineer, went round Africa, parts of Asia, checking out the locomotives that had been supplied by the Hunslet Engine Company, and also giving his fairly clear comments on prejudices against some of the indigenous workers, and an example of how railway companies designed locomotive footplates with prejudice in mind. One of the interesting collaborations we did is actually back in 2020 now, just after lockdown, was with the Geraldine Connor Foundation. We worked on a project called Represent, where we opened ourselves to critique of the museum by a group of young people about absence of stories of people of colour in the museum. And we actually had some interesting proposals on redeveloping, reinterpreting our collections, creating new exhibitions with a sensibility that actually took on the importance of colonial stories in the museum. These are kind of one-off events. The work that I've been doing and the research that I've been doing is time limited, capacity limited, and one of the frustrations that we have is that we struggle to break into research networks. We're involved in the Slavery and STEAM project, which includes the Science Museum Group, but that was a kind of backdoor. We got in through the back door on that. So I'd just like to discuss how a regional museum actually manages to break into research networks and makes the most of an important collection and maximises our ability to tell the stories that have just been alluded to. So happy to answer any questions later, and I'll stop doing that.
Thanks very much, John. Absolutely fascinating in terms, you wound up by pointing to the absences, but I mean, the whole thrust of your talk is that it's present. It's present there as soon as you open your eyes. We have some questions in the question and answer panel already. Please do feel free to put in questions as you go. There's no need to wait until the end. And we look forward now to hearing from Erin.
Hi everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about collaboration in a more personal way. So I'm just going to reflect on the experience of doing a collaborative doctoral award. So I did a doctoral award between the Science and Industry Museum, Science Museum Group, and the University of Manchester on the history and heritage of Liverpool Road Station, aka oldest station in the world, built in 1830 for the Liverpool Manchester Railway. And when I was thinking about the collaboration aspect of it, I was thinking about how useful it was for generating ideas as a researcher and just making connections between sources of material that you might not otherwise have seen. So part of this was I was invited to a lot of museum meetings, would have informal chats in staff rooms and go to more formal kind of forward planning for the museum and galleries, and just kind of listen to other people's kind of interest points and suggestions, and I'd be feeding them research and information. So it was really good to have that dialogue, and sometimes things that seemed obscure would suddenly become very important later on. It also gave me amazing access to a museum audience, so I was able to do different kinds of outreach and talks to the public that would be harder, I think, for a PhD student to do on the standard university route. And it also, I think, working in the museum environment also made me much more aware of the stories I can't tell through my research, because I was answering research questions for the doctoral thesis and had a defined scope. I was interested in Liverpool Road as a site of memory, but I couldn't cover everything within that. So it gave me this kind of awareness of those people who are outside of traditional railway history, outside of the archive. And I've just been thinking in just an ongoing way about how we can engage people who don't necessarily have a familial or tangible connection with this kind of history and heritage, how we can bring those stories and those people into it. So I just thought I'd share, this is a question I had at a few conferences. Some of my research was on the mid-19th century history of the station complex, and what I did for the thesis is I charted how it both operated as a freight station from the 1840s onwards, and almost kind of contrasted that and considered that against how the early railway station became a site of memory. So some of my papers would be about this earlier period where there really weren't any women working at the railway stations. So I'd be referring to men, station masters, engineers, all the usual suspects. And so I just thought I'd highlight that I think one of the ways I started to think more about my site study was for using approaches from urban history and social history. I started to look about the relationship between the station and the environment around it. So Liverpool Road was alongside this field called the Camp Field, which was known as a site of nuisance because it was kind of beyond the realms of regulation for Manchester corporations. So there would be union meetings and unregulated fairs and traders on this field, which was genuinely talking maybe like 10 meters away from the railway station. I've done a little map here. You can see on the very far right, you can just about make out the word Camp Field. So it's just an open space, almost just a kind of little pocket of earlier pre-industrial Manchester that's just hanging on next to the station here. But it's really interesting in terms of the railway station history, because it almost gives the LNWR, who were running the station at the time, a pretext to expand, because Manchester Corporation are more than happy to try and enclose the field, the unruly field, and also demolish the housing. You can see there's several streets of housing. I think there's about 58, 59 properties that became the site of the latest warehouse at Liverpool Road Station. And slum clearance was very much perceived as actually somehow solving an ill of the industrial city. And so I was interested to research the relationship between the railway company and the Manchester Corporation. But going back to my point about peopling it, how we can get, women, children, people of different social classes, social backgrounds and cultures into the story of a railway station that was, I was looking at an operational history, and it's predominantly working class white men's stories. One of the annual events on the Camp Field was Not Mill Fair. And this is reported on 2 weeks every Easter, described by the Manchester Guardian as the annual resort of the working classes. There's this beautiful guidebook at Manchester Central Library that basically tells middle class people to go and check it out because it's so interesting and exotic, but don't go there at night. So it's really fascinating because I kind of charted Not Mill Fair across a few different years, and you see the same kind of touring and traveling groups, the same circuses, the same menageries, the same human zoo exhibits coming there every year. And I was just really interested in the proximity of this to the station. And then not only this, I'll explain why I call this slide Animal Magic in a moment, but there's evidence that the railway station is actually used to transport the animals to and from Not Mill Fair. So these are things I started to touch upon as I was doing the research, but I think have so much potential for further collaboration and further storytelling. So I think I might stop there because I know we're a little bit tight on time. I can always talk about Walter from the cartridge department if anyone has any questions, but I just thought I'd bring in animals because this is going back to my initial point about being inspired by conversations with staff, when you're talking to people who are running the early years programme, they are really interested in things like animal stories because they're relatable to the content of what the children are doing in whether it's shapes and colours and literacy. But they're actually an inroad to much more complex stories about the relationship between humans and animals. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
And what a wonderful more than human note to end on for a railway panel. Thank you, Erin. That was gorgeous. I loved that. Our last contributor now to the roundtable is Mike. So Mike, I'm going to hand straight to you if that's okay. Again, questions in the question and answer box, please, folks. Thank you. Mike.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Hopefully you can see that in share mode. So I would like to start with 3 questions, which actually I'm not starting with. Erin, John and Sam have already pushed us into these. Who's involved in producing history? Whose stories are being told? And how do we tell difficult stories? Or indeed, do we tell difficult stories? Has the slide moved on? Sorry, it should have done. Nope. Okay, hopefully it has now. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, fab. So one of my hats that I wear, I'm an associate editor of the Journal of Transport History, the world's oldest transport history journal, 70 years old this year. It started in a very collaborative way as a venture between those in the academic world and beyond. However, over the years, pressures to professionalise kind of shifted the emphasis away. So really, it's largely these days almost exclusively kind of academic content, although with some museums content as well, and content coming from those beyond the academic world. That's quite exclusionary, unfortunately. So by and large, heritage professionals, enthusiasts, and to a certain extent museums professionals have lost out a bit in this. And as a result of that, I think we in the academic world have lost out as well from the expertise and insight that they bring. As a journal, we are trying to address this, but we're not alone in this gap. Railway history, history of science, history across the board, many academic disciplines, probably all. This is a massive lost opportunity, I think, particularly for as far as railway and transport history go, given the public interest in these topics, these areas. You know, we're really losing out if we aren't able to work with and discuss our topics with all sorts of people. That's something I'm trying to do in my own work, and as has already been mentioned, the project that I co-lead, the Railway Work, Life and Death project. So it's collaborative, looking at accidents to railway staff in Britain and Ireland before 1939. It's working across institutions, so my own institution, the University of Portsmouth, but with the National Railway Museum and the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick, and we're also working with the National Archives of the UK and the RMT Union. A key part of this is that we're working with volunteers beyond the academic world to transcribe records and to research cases as co-productively as we can. And those involved tend to come from fields, rail enthusiasts and family history backgrounds, they're not exclusively. That said, you know, they're beyond the academic world, but they are people who tend to have an existing interest in the past. These are brilliant people, and I can't thank them enough for all of the hard work they do to make the project possible. But to a certain extent, they and we all are the usual suspects. And that's really challenging, I think, and challenge for us as a discipline as a whole. So how can we engage with more diverse audiences in undertaking historical work, especially in areas like railway history that are traditionally dominated by a particular demographic? Part of this is thinking about who we're speaking to, I think. And we have, within the Railway Work, Life and Death project, tried to reach beyond the bounds of certainly traditional railway history. Again, thinking about the work with family historians, local historians and other groups. But it's challenging reaching audiences who might not immediately find themselves represented in the records of the era. For the Railway Work, Life and Death project, our records perhaps aren't very diverse, certainly not on grounds of ethnicity. There's a bit of diversity on grounds of gender, although the vast majority of the cases that were recorded dealt with men. The project's got a bit more to say on class, as we might expect, because we're largely talking about the working classes as far as it's possible to tell from the records. But this then raises that question of where the workers fit in the stories, where users fit, where people fit within our stories, and indeed, where do discomforting stories fit? the Railway Work, Life and Death project focuses on accidents and traumatic pasts. That doesn't fit with a rather rose-tinted specs view of the past that still tends to dominate railway history in a public view, at least. And I'll include in that in museums and heritage environments, although they have a difficult task to juggle on that one, certainly within enthusiast circles. And I face some active pushback on the sorts of stories that the project is looking at, trying to tell, because people don't like it. So how do we reach and ideally work with people when the topic is discomforting? And how do you do this ethically? These are some quite big questions. So then just to tie this together, I'm going to return to the questions I started with, slightly rejigged, and put these all to the panelists and to everyone who's watching. How do we increase the diversity involvement in history, whatever field of history we're working in? How do we increase the diversity of stories that are being told? And how do we tell difficult stories, particularly those that people might not want to hear? And with that, I'll stop.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you so much for that. And you can have a small gold star for being the only panelist who actually stuck to the time limit. So well done, you. Applause. And you've also done part of my job for me, that you've managed very admirably in that in those closing words to sum up some of the key themes that I think all the panelists have touched on in different ways. Themes that are not just important for the history of the railways, which all 5 of us are deeply engaged in and interested in, but obviously have much broader resonance and relevance for the history of science in general, which is why I'm so happy that this is the panel that is kicking off the conference. So we've got some key themes, I think, that we can pull out and discuss here. I'm going to witter on for a little bit, not very long, to give people a chance to kind of get their thoughts in gear and start putting questions in the question and answer panel there. But it seems to me that we've got, drawing on those 3 questions that Mike pulled out, we've got kind of like 4 themes that kind of emerge from the presentations. We've got themes about collaborations, basically, how do we work better together as professionals to pull out these stories and to think about the stories, to think about the kind of pushback, as Mike says, that we might get from stories, to think about our responsibilities, both ethically in the present day and ethically to the past, to think about the more than human stories that we could potentially tell, which of course then have ramifications in the context of, not just working class movements of animals, but I mean, I'm thinking of things like, using the railways to move horses around for the hunts for fox hunting, and the implications that has about the control of the land and control of the landscape. So how do we collaborate to think about stories? How do we work on the co-production of knowledge? How do we work together again as professionals to develop these better stories? Whose stories are we telling here, and whose stories could we tell better? We've got, I'm looking at the Q&A for the moment. We've got some specific questions that are coming up there. I just wanted to open it out to the panel now in the first instance. We've got, I think, about 20 minutes left for discussions. Are there any thoughts from hearing other people speak that you want to get across before we get into a general Q&A? Opening this out to any member of the panel. Any kind of responses, initial kind of, okay, this is...
Yeah, I was interested to hear, John's point about the access to academic research when you're coming from the museum side of things, if you're not already embedded in an established network. I was very lucky because Science History Museum is part of the Science Museum group, and research has become quite embedded in their practice. But I know museums, curators, I'm sure John may speak to this point, have very little time to do the original research. So it's how you can connect the audience to the original research out there, which I'm sure there are many more interesting stories to be told. So I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit more on that, John.
Yeah, happy to. As I say, I've basically been doing what I can over the last, say, 4 or 5 years, and becoming more aware of what's out there. And I've done some research at the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. They've got a really good Robert Hudson archive as well. But it's just really frustrating that we've got masses of archival material that we just don't have time to go through. We've been approached by there's a local group called Heritage Colonial, and they do Black history, and they've kind of done a lot of work. But again, it's quite piecemeal, and it's quite kind of just when we can really. So my kind of concern is like, how do we actually embed this into what we do as a museum service? We have a colonial histories working group, but again, it's something that people fit into their daily work. I've raised Robert Hudson's as a kind of potential research area many times, but you know, wagons aren't sexy, so you know, what can you do? But hopefully, some of the stories, the human stories that lie behind, you know, the Bybury story and others, will gradually start to kind of become apparent that they are, you know, they're a jumping point to kind of wider histories.
There's actually a question. Oh, sorry, Sam, do you want to come in there quick?
Yeah, I was just going to ask John to talk a bit more about the Steam and Slavery project and that, how important and how difficult it is to get that kind of work. And the other thing I was going to say is, I think any historians of science listening to this will be horrified that it's difficult for museum professionals to find us, because we would love always, I don't think there's a historian of science technology in the world who doesn't want to work with museums. And maybe that's something that the BSHS needs to think about, is how we create a kind of directory of how you get in touch with us all, and how we find each other, because we need to improve that. But I was going to say, John, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that Steam and Slavery project.
Okay, can I just pause that for a second, because I'm going to bring in a question from the chat which might help inflect the way in which you talk about that, the Steam and Slavery project. So we've got a question from Will, who says they are asking, how do you display or plan to display images that have an obvious intended narrative? Basically, is it difficult on the museum floor to manage these narratives, given the ways in which visitors tend to use museum spaces? And I think this is also really relevant to the way that academics and museum professionals interact with each other, given that academics tend to be text focused, whereas most people don't really look at huge wadges of text and think, oh, brilliant, lots of stuff to read. So, John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question, Sam. It's certainly, I would say, used carefully, because people don't always read the text. We did an exhibition called Living with Machines last year with the British Library. We talked about the role of Irish people coming in to kind of like provide the labour force for the early industrialisation, and we had a complaint about that. The person who read it didn't read everything and said that we weren't talking about colonization in India, and we made about 3 references to it. So it's you can't always control how people interact with interpretation, and you have to just try and be as careful as possible and make sure that you kind of road test your information, and do as much consultation as well in advance. And consultation is key. It's time consuming, it's resource hungry, but it's important. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I was going to say that very point about time consuming, to do this sort of work, whether academic, whether based in museums, whether beyond, and particularly building those co-productive collaborative relationships, it takes time if you're going to do it meaningfully, which you have to do, if everyone's going to get something for them out of it, which it needs to be. And the problem is, of course, no one has time or resource to do that. If you're saying, I'm going to do this great work, but it's going to take 2 years before it's going to bring something that's, demonstrable on the museum floor, or in terms of academic publication, or whatever the desired output that those above you are looking for, it's not going to go down well. So it's a really tricky one to deal with, unfortunately. I don't have any great solutions.
Sorry, forgot to press my unmute button. How many times have I done that in my life? We do have somebody with their hand up in the audience. I think it's Tom. Tom, I'm not sure if you want to ask a question, but you can't use the Q&A. Can you put something in chat and tell us what your preference is, or if it's just an accident that the hand's up? Because we really do want to get as many voices in here as is possible. So in terms then of the kind of stories that we've seen developing here, again, I mean, I think the key question seems, or the key question, one of the key questions, seems to be the issue of how can we tell these stories better? How can we tell them more effectively? Part of that has to do with the audiences. Part of it has to do with getting access to the information. Although, as we heard in John's talk, I mean, what struck me there was that, yes, you can point to the absences in the story, but there are also some very huge glaring presences there that need to be dealt with as well. Can I invite you to reflect on that? She said, generally staring at faces. Erin, maybe some thoughts from you?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. The kind of part of the tension Mike was talking about. You can quite quickly gather people interested in railway history, and volunteers tend to be people who've got an interest already or a place-based relationship. So obviously, with the shiny head beaching in Sam's talk, that there's still a lot of there's still some kind of, I think, pain bound up with nostalgia about how the railways used to be for a lot of people. And so you can quite readily get volunteers. I think I say, having never recruited railway volunteers, I have recruited people for oral histories. I think there is kind of a wealth of people interested, but yeah, it's how we can bring their specific interests, which may centre on a particular line, a particular place, a particular type of locomotive. How we can, maybe a good starting point is actually to do some co-production with existing groups, and how we can bring in these stories that almost populate railway history with all of the people that we're not talking about, through empowering people who are already invested in railway history to broach those difficult subjects. So it might be that we as academics and curators need, perhaps, what I'm sure we're all developing all the time, because it's difficult histories are hard, and decolonizing history is an ongoing process. But how we can empower people who may just have an interest in something very small and very specific to think that, no, actually, this is really important to this story. That's just my thought on it, really.
Yeah, so going from the specific to the general in that sense. I've got thoughts on that, but Sam, you had your hand up, go for it.
I was just gonna pick up on Erin said small. I think one of the problems in railway history is some of our objects are very big, and both physically big and metaphorically quite big, and they tend to swallow all of the oxygen in the room. And the problem for museums is that these are particularly the NRM, and I'm going to be defensive of them for a minute. These objects are where they generate their money, and so you can't decouple, to use a good pun, that requirement to bring in money and to bring in an audience. But that being said, there are opportunities, and I think what's interesting, and I don't know what John thinks on this, is these objects are largely divorced from their colonial settings. So we have an object and it'll say made in Leeds on it, but then there's no, it's not obvious to an attendee of a museum where that object's been. It's kind of life journey, its production is clear, but then its use and how it got into the museum is kind of quite hidden. And that's where academics maybe can make a big difference, because we can come in and we can help with trying to do the research and trying to find out those text-based sources. And I solidly believe that we can put both next to each other. The one thing that's quite absent in some industrial museums is interpretive boards, and if we could put a little bit more of that in, and we can put it, and specifically we need to foreground it in the education programs, and I do think that is happening, but it's not necessarily translating onto the museum floor because of the big elephants in the room.
Using the, Mike, I'm going to come to you in a second. Is the source here then? I mean, rather, do we turn to zoos to talk about elephants in the room and to talk about the more than human? As you were speaking, I was thinking exactly of the kind of panels that you have next to animals in the zoo these days, explaining the history of how this animal got to be where it is in a way that does manage somehow to engage the audiences. I see people reading them. Mike, over to you.
It was, yeah, thanks. I just want to pick up on Sam's point about the big things, and absolutely, this is kind of been a real challenge within railway transport history in terms of the focus over the years, particularly on the production of these things rather than on the use and the social meanings and the cultural meanings of them. At the same time, it also presents another challenge in terms of museum heritage environments, in that they're difficult to deal with. You can't take a big thing like that out into a public environment, and there's a challenge there when we're thinking about co-production collaboration, of we're requiring people to come to us, and therefore for those who are perhaps not necessarily comfortable at home in museums environments or within higher education environments, that's a real challenge. How do you get them across the threshold? So, you know, how can we go out to other people, to audiences we want to work with, different communities, and say, start a discussion with them about why these things might be of relevance to them and why they might be interesting, but on their terms.
Is the digital space likely to be, I mean, again, this is expensive, but is the digital space likely to be of use there in terms of being able to present big objects and move big objects around?
Go on, Erin.
Oh, I was only thinking about, so in where I work, which is a department that teaches in museum studies, students were using Matterport technology to do 3D scans of galleries. So, you know, you can make 360-degree scans of galleries, not 3D. We're not printing galleries out at home, but that could be an option. But yeah, so I don't know. I have to admit my ignorance here. I'm not sure what Transport and Railway museums are doing right now to kind of make their on-site spaces available online, but there's clearly the technology to do that.
John, do you want to come in?
Yeah, we've fairly recently used Google Arts and Culture as a kind of a platform for, you know, making our collections more accessible, and it's not as kind of costly as some other ways of doing it. But you know, you can almost, there are ways of getting across that kind of bringing people in where they feel a bit kind of intimidated or not fully at home. A bit like the Represent project that we did. It was almost like a takeover, you know, for an entire week. And I believe that Represent went to a few other different organisations and asked if they could use their spaces, but they got quite defensive responses. So I think institutions need to kind of, and I know there are the kind of restrictions, and some institutions are a bit more closely aligned to central government, shall we say, and different kind of political priorities. But you know, certainly from a local government point of view, we were fairly free to do that. And I think it's partly an attitudinal thing on the part of curators. It's just, and it's partly workforce development as well, because you know we're all mainly white, mainly middle class, you know, professionals. So there's something in there too. But certainly, if we're expecting people to come in and work completely on our parameters and our kind of established attitudes, then I think we're on a loser. I think we have to kind of allow people to kind of take over the space.
I think there's actually a question now in the chat that really speaks to that last point that you were making, John, about the nature or the makeup of the group of museum professionals. So we've got Scott's question there asking, who is choosing what stories are being told? Is it the issue that one interest group is dominant in answering that question and other groups just aren't participating? And I think, Sam, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, I did, if I can come in first. I think this is an important question. I'd just like to point out that we have a second panel on railways in this conference, which is on imperial railways, which will look very different to this panel. But I wanted to give an example, because I don't think we should just say it's museums and it's academics problem. For railways, we also have a massive heritage railway sector that in the UK, and one of the most tourist economically productive for a certain part of Wales is the narrow gauge railways, and the Welsh Highland Railway has just repatriated 2 locomotives from South Africa. They have been made Welsh. It's like they've been gone through a cleansing process, because what's important to the heritage railway is that they are now more reliable and that they're going to run and generate more income for them to continue their heritage operations. But those engines worked in quite controversial circumstances in South Africa, and it's on us across the railway sector to engage new audiences, to engage a younger generation of volunteers in both museums and heritage sector, and to ensure and to push these organizations who maybe have different goals in mind, which is to keep the lights on in quite stringent economic times, to also make sure that there is a space left open to enable new people to come in and tell stories to what is a very large existing audience.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, again, tying in with all of this, is that there's a real challenge for any of us involved in this, in that this potentially involves ceding authority and recognizing expertises that aren't ours, and that's, you know, that can be discomforting for us and really, really challenging. It can be tremendously productive if we can do it, but we need to kind of step aside, I think, on that one. And that's, again, it's difficult to do, but really important.
I'd like to invite John and Erin to sort of come in with their closing thoughts on that particular point as well. Particularly, I think, John, the issues that you've raised several times about pushback, you've mentioned a couple of times as you were speaking.
Yeah, we've had some quite difficult situations. We did some social media work around Park and the Yorkshire cake, and the fact that has kind of colonial roots. That got a lot of criticism. Usually it's from quite a kind of people who've very decided views on particular aspects. But to be fair, it's not really put us off. I think we deal with it, and we deal with the points made. We have actually sort of tried to bring in youth groups as well. We've got a youth group called the Preservative Party, and they curated an exhibition, completely curated an exhibition called Overlooks at Leeds City Museum. It's just closed, unfortunately, and they foregrounded, sorry, I hate that word, but they could put front and centre the some of the stories around the use of Hudson's wagons in diamond mines and gold mines in Africa. So it is one of those kind of overlooked stories.
Yeah. Erin?
Well, I'm just going to give an additional plug for the companion session that we have on Thursday, which is 3 o'clock UK time on the 6th, where we'll talk more. Well, I'll be chairing, and some people who work in different areas of railway history and heritage will be discussing issues of imperial legacies of the railways and decolonising railway history, and well, basically problematizing it. As you can tell from our current discussion, we don't have the answers, but I think we're having some really important conversations. And I just wanted to just bring back a point that I talked a little bit about nostalgia, and actually some pain, you know, bound up in that like the past was a better time is kind of a trope that people are quite heavily can become quite heavily invested in. So I think it's one thing that's going to be really interesting to move forward is how we navigate people's kind of quite personally held attachment to certain stories of the railways, and like I was saying before, like how we bring in other stories rather than push out the original narratives. And one thing that can be quite a useful hook in public history is there's a lot of centenaries coming up. We've got the centenary of the Stockton Darlington Railway in 2025, Liverpool Manchester Railway 2030, and then the kind of groups that Sam was talking about, the heritage railways and the museums, are very keen to do these big, large-scale celebrations. And I think it's about thinking about how we could nuance the interpretation of the history of those lines, and start to, in our limited capacity as historians and heritage professionals on tight budgets and so forth, how we can very slowly start to turn ideas about how great the railways were into, well, this is a you know, a groundbreaking technology, but what were the ramifications of this technology around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of pushback that we've seen publicly in relation to, for example, the National Trust and other kinds of public statues, you know, you can see kind of the railway history is going exactly the same way for precisely the kind of reasons that you've just outlined, Erin. But I think it's another example actually of why railway history is so important, is so significant, and why it needs to be, you know, more of a thing within the history of science. I was asked to bring this to a close by 5 to the hour. It's now somewhat past 5 to the hour, but hey, I'm chair and I'm in charge until they press the button to turn me off and keep talking. So I would just like to say thank you very much to all of our panelists for such thought-provoking, such challenging, and just such, you know, chewy that's a really bad metaphor, but such chewy ideas to start off with to kick off this conference. I've really enjoyed sharing it. I'm looking forward to continuing conversations with all four of us in the room now. As we've heard from Erin and Sam, there is another railway session that's been scheduled, I think for Thursday, is it I had it written down here on the 6th at 3 p.m. and I will look forward to seeing as many of you possible at that session. So good afternoon, good evening and good night, I guess. She said, riffing on a film that she can't remember now, but thank you very much for your attention, everyone. Thank you for the questions. We did have one suggestion, which I'm just going to get in at the end, that possibly a wiki editathon might be useful to think about in the context of the railways. We'll certainly keep that in our thoughts for us, and thanks for putting that in the chat for us. Thank you, everybody. Thank you and goodbye. Looking forward to the next session.
Bye, thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thanks.